Okay, here we go with lecture 5 from Armitage and Braddick. This one is talking about Class by Keith Wrightson. So in order to talk about how the English or the British Atlantic world views these things, we have to talk a little bit about the way the English do. The English have have very much a class history. A history of class as an important component of organizing their society, as we saw before, talking about the way government works, that it's very firmly tied to gentleman's status. So in this English society, your ranks are largely unchanging. You are a certain rank, you are to the manner born, or you are not, right? So, and it's, according to Wrightson, it's largely in the medieval period and earlier, it's split into sort of a bifurcated system. It's the better sorts, the small strata of the ruling class, either of noble birth or high status that is passed on to their descendants. So you have the better sorts, and then you have the mass of the other people who are the lower sorts. Originally, this comes out of the notion of the lord and the peasants, or the nobles and the peasants, but that's sort of split. So there's really, you know, within that there's sort of subgroupings, but writ large, it's a function of a two-part structure, the better sorts or the lower sorts. What happens in this period of the just prior to the period we've discussed and accelerating through this time frame is that you have a new group that begins to muscle in between the two, and they call them the middling sorts. They have a higher status, usually because of some trade or craft or engaging in merchant aspects that increases their wealth. So they're above the peasants' status, but they haven't quite broken through to the better sorts, the ruling class. So you have this emergence of a middle group they call the middling sorts. Now, this now tripart system is accelerating because you have an increasing population. This increasing population is creating a horde of people who are mired in the lower sort status, but you have people who are able to rise out of this status and achieve some sort of income. And one of the opportunities that is fueling this is a new economic order that revolves around trade. Going back to feudal times, wealth was manifest in property. But as a result of opening up trading relationships and this trading world, you have the opportunity of folks to benefit in this system who rise in prominence because of their attachment to some function of the trade and trade that's expanding in great volume. And so this allows for a little bit more fluidity for people to move up, not so much fall back, but more to move up, especially in muscling into the space between the better and lower sorts by creating the middling status. So merchants begin to rise because they have new opportunities. These new opportunities are expansive trade in which the Atlantic world, this colonial system, greatly accelerates this process. There are people who can rise because they tap into some aspect of the Atlantic world, either still in the British Isles or increasingly as they move out into the colonial system. So these merchants begin to demand more respect because they're increasing in wealth and power. So this system is, so we've largely been viewing this system from the view from the British Isles, but now we have to shift our perspectives to being in the colonies. So the colonies, this is a place where opportunity exists for some people to do very well, and I'll give you some examples. Some colonies are initially still this split. And when we think about the early colonies in the Chesapeake, Virginia, and in the Carolinas, these colonies are, they're initially established by adventurers, right? So folks who are looking for opportunity, many of them, the sons who are not going to inherit the wealth either in the British Isles or in Ireland, their first plantation system, they took the opportunity to go to these colonies, and these colonies were initially established with the idea of people getting rich, right? So you have some nobles or people of noble birth who are involved in the establishment of these colonies, particularly in the Virginia and the southern colonies. And that's certainly true when you see the colonies that are established in the Sugar Islands as well. So you have a small number, a small strata of this better sorts, but then they bring with them a bunch of the lower sorts, the folks they anticipate doing all this work. And this sort of relationship is one where you have quite a split between the two. You have the small number of what they would call the better sorts, the gentlemen who come from proper places and proper breeding, and then the meaner sorts or the lower sorts. So colonists, the people who come to these, establish these colonies are hoping to get rich. It's very clearly seen in the Sugar Islands, but you can see it in Virginia as well with the development of tobacco, right? And we'll talk a little bit about a Virginia example in just a second. So some of the colonies have this very much this bifurcated system. But then again, excuse me, that outlier of New England has a different structure. It's much more egalitarian. The structure in the community is much flatter. You have less of a hierarchy of a small strata of the noble born or aristocratic birth or that sort of higher social status, and then a lot of folks in a lower status. The New England colonies are founded primarily by, not exclusively, but primarily by the middling sorts. So the Puritans come over as a family unit, and they're pretty clearly definitive of the middling sorts. They also don't rely upon a lot of imported labor. So the Virginia colonies relies initially upon indentured servants who are, of course, by definition, in the lower sorts, right? And the New England colonies don't establish that sort of extractive plantation economy, so they don't have that sort of, there's less of that hierarchical split between a small number of wealthy and a great number of poor. Many of these folks are in similar status, and they also tend to develop themselves as communities. So the Puritan ideal is that you build a town where all the townspeople are crowded together and then their fields extend out, right? So the reason why they're crowded together is so they can help each other stay on the straight and narrow by enforcing proper behavior. In the Virginia colony, there was a rapid dispersal as they got in off the coast and went further up the rivers to establish these large plantations growing an export crop. And this export crop is going to be reliant upon coerced labor, primarily indentured servants first, later African slaves. But that status is those who make it, and then the meaner sorts they bring to do the work. So this system is, as we've seen in other contexts, these colonies that rely upon this sort of coerced labor they're much more violent, they're much more unstable because the systems are people looking to get rich. And so you have, in the case of Virginia colony, an unusual trajectory. It takes the following form, and I'm going to talk specifically about a particular illustrative example known as Bacon's Rebellion. So in the Virginia colonies, this is a colony that was initially founded by adventurers looking to get rich. It went bankrupt and was absorbed by the crown. And when it was absorbed by the crown installed a ruling governor of noble birth, and he attracted those of like-minded status. So in the Virginia colonies, you have the development through the 17th century of a set of colonists that there are certainly a ruling class that develops. And so this ruling class was rigging the system to benefit themselves. They ran the system so they excused themselves from having to pay tax duties to the crown on the tobacco. And so smaller producers were taxed, And this took the form of the following thing. They had to contribute a certain amount of their product, tobacco, to the crown, who would then sell it. So the ruling order in the colony was rigging the system so that they didn't have to pay these tax duties, and others did. They also had a very positive relationship in their eyes with the surrounding native peoples, who they bartered with to acquire furs. And so they were this ruling order was shipping tobacco, and they were also shipping furs, and they were benefiting from this process. In exchange, they wanted to maintain good relationships with the native peoples, because they didn't want to upend this fur trade. So they severely limited the ability of small farmers to carve out new lands on the frontier, because they didn't want to upset the native peoples, who they were busily engaged in a nice lucrative trade for both sides. And so you have, in effect, a system where the laboring sorts in this community, many who came in indentured servant status, who completed their indentured servitude, were paid off with their property and their tools, but then they were taxed on the product they produced, and they were also prevented from going out and acquiring new land. So this was leading to a lot of tension in this community. The immediate trigger of Bacon's Rebellion is not necessarily important. It's a nephew of the governor who finds an opportunity in the unrest in the colony to take advantage and hopefully rise in his status. That's incidental, right? So what happens is, in Bacon's Rebellion, there's a rebellion against the royal authority in the colony. And it is a type of class war, because the people who are in rebellion are the lower sorts, who feel they are stifled by the ruling order, who are rigging the system for their benefit at their expense. They also are prevented from expanding, hopefully acquiring new lands that would be not worn out from tobacco growing. So these new lands would be places that they could make their fortune or spread out and establish their own homesteads, because the governor and the ruling order were preventing them from doing so. They felt that they were stuck in a poor economic status as they were. So this rebellion, which was quite violent, is a type of class war. So the royal governor appeals for help from the royal authorities, who send the Royal Navy with Royal Marines, who show up to squash the rebellion. And they do. So the rebellion is physically squashed by the crown. But in investigating the roots of this conflict, the crown recognized that this system was rigged against the lower sorts, and was rigged to favor the local ruling authority, somewhat to the detriment of the crown itself. So they resolved this conflict in an interesting way. Certainly some of the people in rebellion were punished, but the crown supported the idea that the restrictions on their expansion were unjust. And that even though this was going to provoke more ill will with the native peoples, it was more important that these folks were made happy, these lower sorts, that they had an opportunity that was being blocked by the ruling order. There's plenty of land, as they saw it, available in the colonies, and to pen these folks up was not doing them any favors, nor was it doing any favors for the crown, who was seeking expansive colonies to help serve as a measure of control over this territory. The solution came in the form of a type of buying off the folks in Bacon's Rebellion. They received the opportunity to expand their farms, and they were elevated in status over the relationship with the native peoples because they were Englishmen. And this Englishman kind of takes the form of a racial identity rather than a class identity. So this issue of class, it's harder to maintain these class distinctions in the colonies, partly because the colonies, the opportunity to escape this system is much more available than it is back in the home islands. If you are in the lower sort of class in in the British Isles, there's really not much opportunity in the British Isles for you to advance. In the colonies, there's greater opportunity. And so it's much more fluid for people to rise in status because of the opportunities available in the colonies. It's harder to keep these lower sorts locked in their lower status if they have an opportunity to become their own plantation owners. It also elevates, it results in a class identity as we, as fellow Great Britons, have more in common with one another than with the native peoples. And so they elevate this sort of group identity of being British over what were previous status of lower class status in English society. This proves to be a momentous break. Next time, we're going to pick up with a discussion of race, in which I'm also going to draw upon an aspect of this Virginia colony and refer to this Bacon's Rebellion. So this is Keith Wrightson's discussion on class, and next lecture will be lecture number 6 on chapter 9.